Hi guys, Spiritual Bully here. This is going to be a series of critiques that I'm going to be making on Michael Moore's movie Capitalism, A Love Story. Watching his film, I couldn't help but be annoyed by his, how do you say it? I mean, dishonesty in some parts of the movie. Okay, before we get into my opinions and my rants, I just want to admit I don't pretend to be unbiased. I do consider myself more of a capitalist than a socialist. And I'm not a libertarian, but I guess I could say I used to be. But I do still think that Michael Moore's criticism of capitalism is somewhat misguided and somewhat incomplete. So Michael Moore starts out the movie by showing three scenes of people getting evicted out of their houses, not telling us anything about the background story. What are we supposed to think? I mean, we don't know anything about these families that were evicted from their homes. So I guess he's implying that nobody should ever be evicted from their homes, or else, I mean, what's the problem with evicting somebody from their home? If unless they didn't deserve it. If somebody didn't deserve to be evicted from their home, shouldn't we know what was going on? Later in the movie, Michael does show one of the families. It was the family that I actually was most interested in because it showed the woman crying, saying that she lived there for 40 years. Her parents lived there too, so she pretty much lived there since she was a kid. And for 40 years, it was their family's house, starting from her parents. Okay, something should really be screaming out at you. How the hell do you not have a house paid off in 40 years? Then Michael tells us a little more, and he didn't directly say this was what happened to the family, but I'm assuming this is what was implied, which was that the family that's shown to have been evicted from their home had their home for 40 years, but they basically became later suckers to the refinancing propaganda. What probably happened was that in about 20 years, they had their home outright owned. They didn't have to pay mortgage or rent for the next 20 years. But maybe about 10 years ago, they heard of the refinancing campaign and they were led to believe that they could borrow money against their home and just pay it back. The deal, of course, was that if you don't pay it back, we'll take your house. So that's probably what the family did. Otherwise, it makes no sense to me how you can lose a home after owning it for 40 years. I just find it a little hard to believe that you could take 40 years and not pay off your mortgage. And just again, not knowing the full story of this family, Michael is implying that this family was otherwise perfect and just screwed over by a bad mortgage. But that didn't sound like the case. Of course, hindsight is 2020, but I hope people learn from this and it's not too late for some of you out there. I hope you kind of remember the story and maybe 20 years ago you'll remember that you're not going to let this happen to you again. If you own your house and you don't owe anything and you want money, borrowing money against your house isn't the only option. You can sell your house, you can have cash, you can pay rent on the house you're moving to, and if you're not renting for, I mean, depending on how much longer you're going to be paying rent, you might have some extra cash. You'll have no house, but you'll have some extra cash in hand. This is probably not the case with the people who were evicted in the movie. What probably happened was they borrowed money, they couldn't pay it back, they lost their house, and they owed money, and they screwed their credit. So you got to understand your rights and what your options are. You cannot always rely on somebody else to manage your finances. This might not be fair, but you need to understand again that life isn't always fair, and not that this is okay, but this is not necessarily the inherent problem of capitalism. This is just, sadly, the logical conclusion of what property means. Okay, the second story that I want to talk about is when Michael describes the layoff of the GM workers starting in the 80s. He talked about this in his first movie, Roger and Me. So he goes back and tells us that in the 80s, GM was laying off about 20 to 30,000 workers. And when he interviewed Roger, or whoever was a spokesman at the time, he said, well, we as a company will do nobody any service if we go bankrupt or go out of business. And he's right. I don't know how anybody can disagree with that. Seriously. How can you disagree that a company would do nobody any favor if they are irresponsibly run, unprofitable, unproductive, and went out of business? Who would that serve? Maybe their competitors, but I doubt Michael would speak for that. Michael then asks the spokesman, okay, so even if that means laying off 20,000 people. And he, of course, said, yeah, in fact, 20, 30, 40,000. We'll lay off a whole town if that's what it takes to prevent bankruptcy. I paraphrase, but that's essentially what he said. And I don't see how anybody can disagree with this. Now, Michael should have asked if he had a brain, okay, sir, is laying off 20 or 30,000 people either necessary or sufficient to prevent your company's bankruptcy? That would have been a good question. And it would have been interesting to see if that was the only option. But Michael Moore goes on and says, well, they did lay off a whole town of Flint, Michigan, and they still went bankrupt. He's talking about GM. So what you heard was that in the 80s, GM started to lay off workers, started with about 20,000 people, and they went bankrupt despite not hoping to. If you didn't know the exact facts, this will mislead you to believe that one happened right after the other. In other words, GM did not prevent bankruptcy by laying people off, or that laying people off starting in the 1980s led directly to their bankruptcy, when in fact he's missing that the two events were 20 years apart. This is what's very dishonest about it. He makes you think that 20 years apart doesn't really matter. Come on, guys. If it takes 20 years to ruin a company, I think you should be fired for incompetence just for that. If GM really wanted to bankrupt themselves and it took them 20 years, that's pretty inefficient, if that were the goal. So my point here is that GM laid people off to stay in business, and they did for another 20-some years. And when they finally went bankrupt in 2009, it was a series of mistakes that led them to it, not necessarily having anything to do with laying people off in the 1980s. But assuming they didn't do that, what if they did go bankrupt sooner? I mean, I guess according to Michael Moore, GM should have kept people working just to keep the economy alive for Flint, Michigan. And if they went bankrupt, well, I don't know who he's going to blame. Then, I guess for the past 20 years, the people who were employed by GM up until 2009 should have never had jobs, or they should have been thankful they had jobs the 20 years when GM should have been already bankrupt. I don't understand why Michael seems to blame GM for wanting to keep the company in existence first, even if it meant that employees don't necessarily come as priority. Because all good and responsible businesses, as far as I know, have to keep the company alive. You do not employ employees for the sake of giving them jobs or for the sake of giving them money. You employ them only as far as they are necessary to your company's production. And that changes depending on the market, depending on the demand. It's not a fixed thing that you can just say that's it.